Hey, people. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, whatever it is for you. So,
greetings.
Hello.
Let me just do that. So, here we are with our third. Is this our third monthly one? It's a bit weird doing it once a month, isn't it? So
yes,
it's
because
kind of like,
we forget how to do it.
Yeah, we forget how to do it, especially me with all this this stuff going on.
But
I know. Go ahead, Nella. Sorry.
Oh, I just wanted to say I have a good company today. Laura is back with us to discuss about total liberation. And small reminder, Laura is the Institute of Critical Animal Studies Total Liberation Director, a Promoting Enduring Peace board member, and co-founder of Plant the Land, a Gaza-based vegan food justice community and projects team.
Thank you so much for having me on again. I love speaking on this show, so I'm very excited.
I thought it was your first time. I thought it was your first time.
No, the last time actually went on forever, so I guess it's kind of like, first time for this one, but definitely not first time for in general.
You can't get too much, Laura.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for coming back. A new topic as well. Exciting.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, so we're going to be looking at exploring total liberation.
Should we start with oh, sorry, go ahead, go ahead, Roger.
Let me just get rid of that. With Laura, now there's a couple of questions that we've got in advance. Laura, do you want to bring them up first, or should we do that?
Yeah, let's take a look at them.
Should we just do our hellos first?
I could do, yeah. You like doing
that?
Do
that after? I forgot. Yeah, we forgot how this works now.
I flashed them on the screen instead.
This is the first time for all of us. None of us have ever done this show before.
It seems so.
So saying hello to Jonah. I'm not sure if Jonah is here now because Jonah posted their questions earlier. And we got lovely Deb here. Hiya, Deb. We got Jennifer. Hey, Jennifer. And we got Anne, Vegan Rebel 98. Amber Vegan Girl. Philip's here from New York. I like to say my New York. Terrible accent. Inked Hippie is looking forward to seeing Brian. But Inked Hippie, I think Brian might be having a little rest in the bedroom. So I don't know if he'll be able to appear at the minute. We've got Bernie V. Hey, Bernie. And Bernie Brannick, two Bernies. And I think that's everyone so far. But do say hello if you're here. Nice to see everyone.
Right. So there's two of these. So you could take them one at a time if you like, Laura. So both from Jonah and the Whale, or Jonah Whale. And so is total liberation a bit too ambitious as an idea? How about we just aim for creating a vegan Zion, which might be an interesting one for you to tackle.
Yeah.
Not ethno-nationalism, but a ethnico-nationalism vegan movement instead.
Oh, ethico-nationalism. I see what you're saying. So basically,
the dictionary. Hang on, everyone.
Right. So a nation based on an ethical principle, right? Yeah. So definitely an interesting question. I guess I would start off by saying, if you're talking about it in terms of vegan Zion, that's already going to obviously alienate a lot of people who have been very harmed by political Zionism. So, even if you don't mean it that way, which you obviously don't, you explicitly said that in the question, right off the bat, you're going to be making people feel very uncomfortable and, like they don't want to be a part of any movement that is attached to something that has caused so much pain for them. And actually, this kind of leads into something that I was planning on bringing up later on, but I'm going to bring it up here, which is something that I think we need to talk about more in the vegan and animal liberation movement, but also just social justice movements more generally, is the issue of neural pathways and epigenetics, because something that we should be very aware of and sensitive to is that there is recent research that has found out that the human brain is actually much more malleable than was originally thought, and it actually makes pathways between different ideas. So you can actually see physical neural pathways forming in the brain between different associations. And so therefore, if you have an idea that connects to another idea, that there's a pathway that forms to an idea that's positive, that's going to give people a more positive feeling about what you're talking about. But if it connects to something negative, they're going to have a very visceral negative reaction to what you're talking about, even if the thing that you're talking about, they might really believe in and feel positively about otherwise. So, for example, if you're speaking to a Palestinian and you say, oh, we want to create a vegan Zion movement, even if they would have believed in and supported veganism otherwise, and even if you don't mean Zion in the sense of political Zionism, that's going to connect for them to a very, very painful, distressing place. And, you know, most likely they're not going to want to hear anything more that you have to say about that, because their brain is going in this direction where, you know, their mind is saying, warning, warning, danger, you know, this is something that is going to cause you pain. So I think this is a really important thing for all social justice. Yeah, so words matter. Yeah, absolutely. They very much matter. And, you know, whether somebody has a positive association with what you're talking about or not, really can have an enormous effect on whether they are receptive to hearing more and wanting to get involved, or whether, you know, they just really kind of like want to pull back because their subconscious mind is screaming at them to get away from this thing because it's going to hurt them. So that's the first thing I would say about that. The second thing is this question of total liberation being too ambitious. So, you know, this is based on the idea that you can actually have liberation for one group in isolation. And that's really kind of at the crux of what total liberation is all about, is this idea that you really can't do that. If you try to liberate one group, what's going to happen is that either there's, because you're still in an oppressive system, right? So either another group is going to then be oppressed in to replace the one that was removed from that, and or the oppressive system will just find another way of oppressing the original group. But it's not like you can extract one group out of an oppressive system and say, oh, you know, you're never going to be, you know, you're free now, but we have to work on all these other ones separately. That's not how that works. These are all, you know, all forms of oppression are basically different parts of the whole, and they're different manifestations of the same systems of hierarchy and domination. So, you know, I would very much argue that that is not possible. And the third,
we thought we were going to get that. We thought we might get to that a little later, but there's something you might not have seen, Laura, that I wanted to share with you about that that last point you made. In the other two points are really interesting sociologically. This idea of the malleable brain, so that points to the power of socialization, early childhood socialization fits a real kind of pattern, and then you've got a major problem trying to rejig the pathways, if you like. So that, yeah, and then the language thing, of course, is that we are claims makers, and so language is always incredibly important. So as you were saying, Zion is a trigger word.
Exactly.
For some people, and that would, you know, and we've talked about other trigger words. We all know what they are in the movement, and it's not about whether they're accurate or not. It's to do with whether it's a good idea to use them or not, in a sense. But I wanted to show you this. Now, you might not be able to see this too easy. This is from 1989, and this is Donald Watson talking. First of all, he's complaining about Henry Salt. Henry Salt is seen as first wave animal rights, okay, but he was a vegetarian, and he actually criticized veganism in a way, because he said that some people try the consistency trick against vegetarians, and they say, well, what about the eggs and what about the milk? And his position was, first of all, it was a cock and bull argument, he called it, which is an interesting thing for somebody to say in the first place. But he also, let me just drop that out for a minute so we can see this more. He also said that vegetarianism is the main thing to do, because it was more excusable to kill a calf than a full-grown cow. And yeah, so this is in that, you see the logic of vegetarianism there. That's like a book, and there's chapters in it. That's actually online. It's quite interesting. And so so Watson points out that this view was greeted with silence by the vegetarian movement, a silence that prevailed until we broke it. We, the vegans, broke it in 1944. And then he says, now nearly half a century later, with our increased knowledge and experience, we can see what pressing human problems are related, that they will be solved together or not at all, and veganism will be central to their solution. And that kind of really encapsulates how the people who formed the vegan social movement thought about it, that veganism was central part of the entire solution for everyone, you know. And then the final thing is, in a world planned by the Orthodox for the Orthodox, there are difficulties. And I think that's another really interesting point, that we're obviously dealing with a society deeply speciesist, you know, through its culture, and we've got to try and get our reforms or our arguments through that kind of web, if you like, you know. And so all the way back to the 1980s, what you were just saying there was articulated by Donald Watson. I don't know if you've ever seen that one before, Laura, but it's interesting, isn't it?
Very interesting. I have never seen this piece before, and that is astonishing that the argument was being made that it would be more justifiable to kill a calf than a full-grown cow. I mean, that's like, but again, I mean, this is like why the sort of compartmentalized logic doesn't work. You know, if it's wrong to kill, you have to take like an expansive view of that, you know, because obviously, you know, as vegans, we would not agree with that. And we would say, oh, you know, if it's wrong to kill a cow, it's wrong to kill a cow of any age, right? But total liberation just really kind of expands that logic to say, well, you know, if it's wrong to kill a human, then it's wrong to kill a non-human unnecessarily. And if it's wrong to kill a certain type of non-human, then it's, you know, wrong to kill all of them unnecessarily. I mean, it's just, you know, it's just extending the logic, but it's the same foundational logic across the board.
Let's just bring this one up. We'll try and briefly address this, because I want to talk to you about your recent presentations that you've done. In fact, one was only 2 days ago, right? And so, so Jonah is saying, I often wonder why, when the Jewish world population is only 15 million and the vegan world population is said to be 80 million, how come we don't have our own nation or a fraction of the same political influence? So that's a really interesting kind of question. But I mean, I know you could talk about that for an hour, but so let's try and keep it short if you could.
Yeah, that's a big one. I think that we should start with the question of, is that what we want our movement to be? Is a colonizer nation? Because that is actually what we're talking about here. I mean, we're talking about a nation state that was created on a land that indigenous people were living on. And then, you know, it was this ethno state. Now, of course, Jonah is saying, oh, it wouldn't be an ethno state. It would be an ethnico state, right? It would be a state based on ethics rather than ethnicity. And on the surface, that sounds like that would be a good solution to that problem, right? Because, oh, well, it's not ethnically exclusionary, but it is still a state and nationalism, which, you know, inherently is exclusionary. I mean, do we want, because what I'm getting from this is, oh, we want to just have our own little like separatist state where, you know, the vegans live. And how is the rest of the world going to feel about that? Is that going to seem like something where, you know, this is a movement that we want to bring everyone into and be welcoming to everyone, inclusive of everyone, and make this a workable solution for the whole world? Or is this something where we want to be separatist and, you know, have our own little exclusionary club? Is that benefiting the other species?
It wouldn't have to have its own geographical location, though, would it? A nation.
Well, I certainly would say that the way Jonah's question is worded, it very much sounds like it would be a geographical location. Jonah, you can correct me if I'm wrong about that, but that's what that sounds like to me. But I will say that even if it's not a geographical location, it's still a nationalism that Jonah is talking about. And nationalisms are exclusionary. I mean, that's kind of the whole point of nationalism, is to say, well, you know, we all belong and others don't belong, which is really interesting because this leads directly into Erich Fromm and the conference that I spoke at over the weekend, because one of the central tenets of his theory was that belonging is one of the two most pressing human basic needs, is the need to belong. Yeah. So, you know, when you're kind of setting up this barricade of, you know, those who belong versus those who are excluded, that is not a movement that is going to, you know, reach large numbers of people and really move the mass society in a more liberatory direction. That's going to set up a barricade of the people that are in the group and the people who are outside the group.
Yeah, in and out groups, yeah. I love it when you come on, Laura. You're really speaking my language here, because I've got a lecture about in and out groups. But yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, human beings seem to, you know, you talked about the brain before, we seem to have this need to create barriers and then kind of monitor those and guard those barriers and all that. And they seem, you know, and then people on the outside are usually seen as lesser than. And of course, the species barrier is an obvious thing, but you've also got, you know, gender and race and all the rest of it. There is one point that, in terms of your answer to that, Jonah said that in Rastafari, what was it, philosophy, religion? What do we call Rastafari? Probably in between a little bit. I don't know. Zion means stands for a utopian place of unity, peace, and freedom. That to me, that would get us into a fight over the language again, wouldn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean, again, it's like, why would you use terms that are going to be alienating and exclusionary and, you know, this is an overused word, but literally triggering, right? These are terms that are literally going to make people feel like this is a movement that they are not wanting to be a part of. No matter what that word may technically mean, the word itself is going to have an impact. So yeah, I mean, I don't know why anyone would choose to use a word like that unless they had some other motive than trying to really build a movement that would speak to everyone and that everyone could feel like they wanted to participate in.
Could you not see it as sorry, Wendy, final thing for me now, shut up. Could you not see it as that kind of idea of reclaiming, you know, like reclaiming like the word like queer and that kind of stuff? Yeah.
Yeah, I would really strongly disagree. And here's the reason why. Because a term like queer was used as a slur against LGBTQI, you know, plus people. But those are the actual victims of that word reclaiming that word, saying, that word now, we're going to set the terms of what that word means, right? I even think reclaiming is kind of like a sort of odd way of putting it personally, because you know, that word was really foisted upon them. So it wasn't like, you know, they were using it originally, it was foisted upon them, but they're saying, this is our word now. We're going to define the terms of how this word is used. And in doing so,
let's call
we
it
are going to...
rebranding. Let's call it rebranding, as all capitalists
Yeah,
would understand that one.
rebranding. Yeah, rebranding is a better way of putting it. I like that term for this. Yeah. But, you know, it's like, and in doing so, they defang that word's ability to harm them. Zion is very different because it's not, I mean, who would be reclaiming or rebranding it? You know, it's not the victims in this case, right? It would be either, you know, the victimizers or people who are just kind of not directly victimizing or victimizer, but, or being victimized. But, you know, it's not like it was used as a slur against a persecuted group. Instead, it's a term that has been used to persecute a group.
So I think this is changing tack a little bit. It's kind of on the topic of the language that we use, and it's kind of coming back to maybe starting back at explaining a little bit, if you don't mind, Laura, what total liberation actually means. Because what I found really interesting the other day when we had our chat before the show, like on the planning meeting, is you made a very clear distinction between total liberation and intersectionality, which I think sometimes those two terms get conflated or maybe are used interchangeably. And I would love for you to maybe just make that distinction for us. And what is total liberation? How does intersectionality fit with that, etc.?
And also, if I can add something before you answer, what does it mean in terms of advocating or in terms of activism? Does this mean that we just adopt a different approach, that we accept the interlocking of oppressions, or does it mean something else, that we strike on multiple levels? So,
Right. So to answer Wendy's question first, so yeah, intersectionality was being used in this movement, and to a certain extent still is being used kind of interchangeably with total liberation. And I myself did not really understand the difference between the terms. And the best piece of writing that I've ever seen on this subject is by our good friend, one of my favorite humans, Christopher Sebastian McJetters, who wrote an amazing piece, Yay to Intersectionality, Boo to Intersectional Vegans. And, you know, what he really meant by that, and Christopher, if you're listening and, you know, I'm not explaining this the right way, please do feel free to correct me on this. But basically, as I understand it, what he's saying is that intersectionality was something that was created as a tool for understanding multiple layers of oppression within a person's identity, multiple, you know, identities that are marginalized and oppressed, and how they intersect with each other, specifically by a Black feminist legal scholar, Kimberly Crenshaw. And she created that originally for Black women to understand, and for everyone else to understand, that the way that a Black woman experiences sexism is different to the way that a white woman experiences it, because she has to deal with not just sexism, but also racism. And those two forms of oppression intersect with each other and then create a racialized form of sexism and misogyny. So the way that she will be subjugated as a woman will be different because of her being Black. And likewise, she will experience racism differently than, say, a Black man, because she will also experience sexism, and the sexism will infuse the racism, and so she'll be racially subjugated in a different way on that basis. So basically, it was a very powerful tool for helping people to understand how multiple layers of marginalization on the identity basis affect people. And what happened, so basically what he was saying is that this is a great tool for that. But to then try to apply it to veganism and animal liberation is really kind of like, number one, misguided, because we're talking about something kind of different with that. We're not talking about multiple layers of marginalized identity, you know, in a human, or even, you know, in an animal, you could make that argument, a non-human animal. You could make that argument maybe, you know, if you were talking about an individual, non-human individual who had, you know, multiple layers of marginalization or subjugation, we'll say, in their case. But, you know, look at like systems of oppression and how animal exploitation and oppression connects with these other systems of domination and hierarchy. That's really something different. So he was saying, number one, this is kind of like not helpful on that level. And number two, it's appropriation, because this was created by a Black woman for other Black women and for, by extension, humans that have, you know, different layers of oppressed identities. But basically, she's not even a vegan. She's not an animal liberationist. And this is taking something that really was meant for oppressed humans and really kind of, you know, using it for something else. So it's really kind of a form of appropriation. And the other issue is that basically this then kind of would redirect the conversations to focus much more on human identity. And while I would say that there is value to that, of looking at, well, you know, to be a vegan, we have to look at like all the factors of what might impact that, right? So if you are, let's say, someone living in Gaza, that's going to be a lot harder for you to be a vegan, because you are having a hard time accessing food at all than it is for somebody, let's say, in suburbia in the US, right? So so that is important and that is helpful, but really that's kind of like, as far as intersectionality goes, when you're looking at it in the way that that term was originally really created. It's not looking at how does this big system of animal exploitation and oppression relate to these other big systems of hierarchy, domination, exploitation. That's something different. So basically, these are two different things, right? So total liberation, on the other hand, and I will say one other thing about intersectionality is, you know, some of us might be aware, I was certainly a part of this sort of internal debate that was happening about, could people who were not intersectionally oppressed, right? So multiple layers of marginalization, or even maybe specifically, you know, just looking at race and gender, or, you know, but like basically if you were not, let's say if you were a white cis man or even a white cis woman, we'll say, could you use or should you use the term, I am an intersectional vegan? And originally the idea, as I understood it, was, well, it wouldn't matter what your identity was to use that term, because it's not about your identity, it's about the lens through which you see veganism, right? So if you see veganism through a lens that takes these other issues into consideration, then you would be an intersectional vegan. But if you kind of look at, you know, veganism as a single issue, or animal rights as a single issue, then you're not intersectional, right? You're not taking an intersectional approach. But then there was an argument that said, well, no, if you're not intersectionally oppressed within your own layers of identity, then you should not use the term intersectional vegan, because you're not intersectionally oppressed. So instead you should say pro-intersectional, right? You support a veganism that is intersectional, but you yourself are not intersectionally oppressed, and therefore you should not use that term. So again, you know, kind of looking at it through the lens of human identity as opposed to beliefs, and as opposed to, you know, a tool for the type of activism that we want to engage in. So basically, these, as I understand them, were Christopher Sebastian's arguments against trying to apply intersectionality, which was never meant to be something that had anything to do with animal liberation or veganism. Trying to apply that term to this movement was just really misguided. Now, total liberation, on the other hand, does originate as a term that specifically is from this movement. So this was a term that came about around the turn of the millennium, and it was actually created by some of the founders of the total liberation movement, include a scholar named Dave Pello, who wrote a book that was the title of it, was Total Liberation Now. You had Steve Best was very involved with this. You had Anthony Nocella. These are the people who also founded the Institute for Critical Animal Studies that I am the Total Liberation Director for. And so total liberation as an idea was this idea that human, animal, non-human animal, and earth liberation movements were intricately interconnected. David Niebert, another scholar who was involved with the founding of this movement, right? So this idea that you can't look at these things in isolation from each other. You cannot understand and effectively approach non-human animal liberation without also liberating humans and the earth. And you can't liberate humans without looking at the human oppression and subjugation of other animals, right? So, and certainly both humans and other species are all dependent on the earth for their survival. So you have to look at all of these issues holistically. And total liberation is actually, it comes from the Eco Anarchist Movement. And what's interesting about it is that, you know, anarchism historically was really focused on ending the state and ending capitalism. So basically self-governance, no hierarchy, no authoritarian structures with power over the people, and you know, no class hierarchy, of course. So that was anarchism's two focuses. But in the 60s, anarchism started to really kind of like expand from that, and I'm talking about Western anarchism now. There are other anarchist philosophies, but basically in the Western culture, anarchism started to really kind of take more of an expansive approach, where it was ending all forms of hierarchy. So obviously that would then involve things like ending white supremacy, you know, ending patriarchy, ending ableism, ending all forms of hierarchy and discrimination and exploitation and et cetera, all systems of domination. So total liberation basically took that, so, you know, this idea of ending all forms of hierarchy within human society, and then said, well, wait a minute now, we have to extend these same ideas to no hierarchy and domination of humans over other species or over nature. I should say, and over nature. So basically, these are two very, really different ideas. And so when you use them interchangeably, it creates a lot of confusion because intersectionality has a very different meaning. Now, it will to total liberation. Now, last thing I want to say about this is that total liberation is inherently pro-intersectional. It does look at things through the lens of intersectionality, as in looking at multiple layers of oppressed identities and how they intersect with each other and how they compound and influence and inform each other. But it also looks at a lot of other things as well. So it is a very comprehensive approach to looking at liberation. And it really takes that stance, again, of in order to liberate one, we must liberate all. There is no compartmentalized liberation. There is no, this one gets liberated and the rest don't. It's total liberation or it's no liberation. We have to approach these issues holistically and look at the bigger picture of how they all inform each other and connect with each other.
So Laura, how does that, because I know this was kind of building on Nella's question as well, how does that actually look within the movement there? Because I think part of the ideology of total liberation is that it doesn't center the concerns of any one oppressed group. It looks at the entire system of hierarchy and domination, and it can look at that through the lens of each identity-based system of oppression.
Yes.
And it does, and you say in your presentation, it stands in solidarity with all identity-based forms of oppression, and it rejects single-issue animal rights activism and left-wing humanism that leaves out non-human animals. So just to kind of get an idea of like how this can look practically, and also maybe some of the criticism that might come from within the movement is that anti-speciesism is a movement in its own right. And obviously there's that, the concern is that other animals need to be at the center of their own movement in the same way that, feminists don't pander to men or the patriarchy in the feminist movement. An anti-racist movement doesn't pander to white supremacy, etc. And I think the complaint and the feeling is that in the anti-species, animal rights movement, vegan movement, whatever we might want to call it, is that often it feels like we're pandering to human issues. And of course, humans are the oppressors of non-humans. Right. But I suppose there is a difference in that, because in the animal rights movement, we are made up of humans, and therefore it's a different situation. And I think just some of the sticking points are that obviously humans are the oppressors, and I think it's almost like their human issues are taken too much into account, that there's too much focus placed on human issues. And an example, I think, Nella, we've spoken about this before, that if a woman is sexually violated, for example, we don't immediately excuse the violator. We don't excuse the violator because of their identity as a man from a marginalized group, for example, because we'd say a violation is a violation. And yet that seems to happen sometimes within the movement when we're looking at human issues as well. We'll say, oh, but, for example, slaughterhouse workers, we'll say, well, we shouldn't attack slaughterhouse workers for their oppression of the other animals, because actually some of them are very marginalized and oppressed themselves, for example. That's just one example. And I think that's sometimes the complaint is like, well, we wouldn't look at it that way if we were looking, a woman being violated, for example. And then the other thing that I was just thinking there is that another of the complaints is that other social justice movements often reject anti-speciesism. So, and so I think some within the vegan movement would say that a call for consistent anti-oppression is only running in one direction, and that actually there's double standards, because in the left-wing social justice, human-centered movements, they're very much speciesist. I don't think that's actually true, because I think some advocates actually have come the other way around. We have a lot of feminists, a lot of people who've come from LGBTQ plus movements who are now striving for animal liberation as well. I think it does work that way around as well. But I think that's the view that people tend to have. And I think we had something the other day I sent to you from George Martin, who was making that point as well in one of his posts. But I just wonder. Oh, thank you, Roger. Roger, that new computer of yours, I tell you. Excellent. Well done. Thank you so much. But I just wonder if you had anything to add and say and come back to on all of that.
Yeah. Whoa, a lot. So let's see. I want to go back to the very beginning of your question. So basically, the beginning of the question was this issue of kind of like decentering, right? That's a big concern that a lot of people have, that if we take a total liberationist approach, the non-human animals are going to get kind of like pushed to the sidelines of their own movement. And that is, of course, a legitimate concern. What I would like to say about that is that when you are building a mass movement, not everybody is going to have the same function within that mass movement, right? So, you know, let's say we have like a wide, you know, we have many, many different individuals within the animal liberation movement, right? Some people might be more focused on actually building a big movement for total liberation. So they believe in animal liberation, but they're very focused on also other types of liberatory movements. And their focus is on building solidarity between those movements and really raising awareness of how the subjugation of non-human animals affects humans and harms humans, and also, of course, the earth, which also affects and harms both humans and non-human animals if we don't have a livable planet, right? So some people, that's going to be their focus. But building a total liberationist movement doesn't mean that every single person within that movement has to make that be their main focus, because some people are going to be focused more directly on the interests of non-human animals. And that is a good thing. We want that, right? We want some people who their main focus is going to be on rescuing non-human animals. We want some people whose main focus is going to be on creating and running sanctuaries. You know, we want a lot of different, I mean, there's many other examples, right? But some people are going to maybe be focusing more on, you know, just specific aspects of this big issue. So it doesn't mean that every single person has to make that building solidarity between movements be their main focus. But having a total liberationist mindset across the board is going to help us with all of those goals. Because this is my feeling on it, is what it's going to do is that it's going to make people in other movements and also just people in general. I mean, we're trying to reach like everyone here, right? And it's going to make people more receptive to hearing what we have to say about non-human animals if they know that our movement is a movement for liberation for everyone, that we care about them too, you know, that it's not exclusionary, that it's not just focused on the animals, right? So it's, and also the work that the people who are focused more directly on the interests of the non-human animals can really inform and empower the work that is being done by the people who are focused more on building cross-movement solidarity. So for example, I feel that I am a far more effective activist for total liberation when I really listen to people who are doing more work directly with non-human animals, because that makes their interests and their lives, you know, much more vivid for me, that I can then talk about how that connects with these other issues. So it's really about building a wide tent movement where you're going to have a lot of different people with different functions within that movement, with different areas of focus within that movement. That's exactly what we want. We don't want everybody having the same focus, but it's about building a mindset across the board of everything that we're doing, whether it's focusing on non-human animals directly or whether it's focusing on building cross-movement solidarity. All of it is that ultimate goal of we want a liberated world for everyone, not just for some, but for everyone. So that's the first thing I'm going to say. And thank you to whoever commented saying that was helpful. I saw that flash up. The second point I want to bring up is, so this question of, oh, you know, we kind of like make excuses for the victimizers, or we're apologists, or we, you know, we focus too much on human suffering, or et cetera, or really just how this movement would benefit humans, right? Too much on, oh, you know, if we free non-human animals, that's almost like instrumental. That's almost like en route to the real goal, which is freeing humans from oppression, right? That's, you know, definitely, again, these are all legitimate concerns, especially, you know, I mean, this instrumentalist view of other animals in nature. I think we need to understand that, yeah, this does harm everyone, right? And so when we do that, when we bypass the interests of non-human animals in their own right, for their own reasons, and we just make it about, oh, you know, well, if we can do this, if we can free other animals, it'll benefit humans. We're actually engaging in the same thing that caused this problem in the first place, which is instrumentalist reasoning, right? Everything's just a means to a more important end, and not really caring about the individual liberation for its own sake. So we need to watch out for that. I need to watch out for that. All of us need to watch out for that who care about the bigger picture. We need to watch out that we don't engage in that. But having said that, I will also say that, you know, for people out there who are familiar with the feminist, Black feminist scholar Bell Hooks, who recently passed away at a tragically too early age, but she was very famous for actually kind of a big tent approach to feminism. And she wrote a book called Feminism Is for Everybody, right? And the whole idea was, yeah, you know, this centers or starts with women's liberation, but we have to look at the bigger picture of gender oppression on the whole. We have to look at how patriarchy harms everyone, right? I can talk about ecofeminists with this too, right? It's this idea of patriarchy harms everyone and everything. So it isn't just about women's liberation or women's rights. It's about the bigger picture of how this system of domination, again, hierarchy, violence, you know, and patriarchy is a very interesting thing because actually people think it's just about men over women. But if you really look at the origins of the term and how it was used, it's also about older men or men with more status oppressing younger men or men with less status, more physically powerful men oppressing physically weaker men. It's got a lot to do with, obviously, the more masculine men oppressing the more feminine or, you know, just not masculine men. So it's like, it's much bigger than just men oppressing women or, you know, women's issues, right? Ending patriarchy is much bigger than that. So again, you know, same thing, right? It's like some people that are trying to end patriarchy are going to focus more specifically on the suffering of women. Then, of course, you have to look at cis women, trans women, right? They may suffer in different ways, in some similar ways or same ways, but also in some different ways under patriarchy. And obviously, again, as I was saying earlier, taking an intersectional approach, right? Black women are going to suffer differently under white patriarchy, you know, white supremacist patriarchy. But then they also have to deal with patriarchy, you know, within their own culture or their own community, you know, or women of different ethnicities, they're going to have to deal differently with that. You know, there's different layers of things. So, I mean, this is much, much more complex, whether you're looking at patriarchy or whether you're looking at animal exploitation and oppression, or, you know, whatever issue it is. I mean, that's really kind of what total liberation is about as well, is kind of looking at the bigger picture. Yes, the original group, but kind of like taking that wide angle lens. And the idea that when you take that wider angle lens, you not only understand all of these other forms that that type of oppression can take and other harms, but you also more deeply understand the origin group, right? Or the center group, the thing that people think should be centered, and the oppression of them and why that happens. I mean, I understand the oppression of women a billion times better for the fact that I have been looking at how patriarchy manifests in other ways and harms other groups. And same thing with non-human animals. I understand why they are oppressed and what forms that takes and the whole underlying ideology behind it when I look at it from this bigger, wider angle lens. So, you know, there's a lot of things I could say. I guess the third thing I'm going to address is this question of the double standard, right? In the the non-vegan social justice movements, and this idea that, oh, you know, they demand our solidarity, but we, don't demand that they should go vegan and they should stand for animal rights. And so there's like this double standard there. So, I think that there's a lot to be said about that. But basically, I would start by saying that we kind of need to look at our own double standard in a way, because what we're saying is that you should do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. You should care about the oppression of others because it's the right thing to do. Yet, that's what we're saying to them, right? But yet, when they want our solidarity, then the attitude is, oh, well, you have to support our issue before we're going to support yours. So it's kind of like this, again, sort of like an instrumentalist logic. And it comes from this very sort of like, I would say really in a lot of ways, it's a very capitalist logic. It's a, well, what are we going to get for that? And it's not even us, of course, because we're not the direct victims in this case. We're actually advocating for another group. So it's this, conditional solidarity, which is no solidarity. Solidarity is unconditional in the sense of regardless of anything else, right? I stand for your rights, that you should not be oppressed, right? So I could say, oh, there's some human group, or not even group, I'm going to say an individual, right? So let's say it's a politician and they are a person from a marginalized group, and I don't agree with their politics. In fact, maybe their politics are really horrible. Maybe they're a warmonger, right? So let's say maybe they are gay, and they're a warmonger. Am I going to not support their rights as a gay person because they're a warmonger? No. I'm going to say, I don't like what you're doing, but as a gay person, I still support your liberation, that you should not be oppressed, right? That would be ludicrous for me to say, well, then if you get, attacked by, in a homophobic attack, or, there's a law that takes away your rights, that's okay because you're a warmonger, so you were disqualified. That's just like ridiculous. So it's like, if we're gonna, support the idea that this is something that you do because it's the right thing to do, then we have to live by that standard ourselves and not have a double standard ourselves. So, there's like a lot of other stuff I could say. Oh, I see a comment coming up. Yeah.
This ties. Sorry, Wendy.
That's all right. We clicked on it at the same time, so we cancelled each other out.
What you said there brings up what Simon is saying. Simple Simon says, because Simon said on my wall today, I think, that if you're an oppressor, that kind of you forfeit your own rights or your own situation to be defended from your oppression if you are an oppressor. So, I can understand that point. What would you say to that? And then I also want maybe consider going back to the Black Lives Matter thing and the famous pig thing.
Yeah, I was just thinking that exact thought.
Do you think now that the heat has gone a little bit from that, although that subject is still a massive problem, we know that. But did we handle that right? The way that.
Well, it depends on your definition of we.
I meant the arguments within the, if you like, the vegan community, and the kind of almost like this is not the time to call someone out for doing something horrible. Yeah. Because that kind of
I would absolutely 1,000,000% agree that it's not the time to call someone out in that way. First of all, that's really ludicrous, because as horrendous as it is, for a pig to be victimized, pigs are being victimized all the time, all over the place. So why would we hyper focus on that one incident that just so happened to be connected to a Black liberation movement and protest? Why would we single that incident out when pig bodies are on display and being literally consumed all over the place, you really have to question what the motives for that would be, because it just doesn't make any sense why we would focus on that when it's such a pervasive problem throughout the society. Another thing is that I think that it's really important that we do consider these colonial dynamics, these dynamics under white supremacy of white people, that when white people criticize Black people, or even when non-Black people criticize Black people, there's always going to be this element of Black people at the bottom of these racial hierarchies that were constructed by white European colonizers centuries ago, that there is a long history of this. And again, it's that wound, right? You're not going to have somebody who's been oppressed looking at someone who's been in the oppressor position, or even just in the more privileged position, maybe not a direct oppressor, but just more privileged. But that person criticizing them is going to, especially even more so in the context, I would say, now I'm not Black, so, I can't speak for any Black person, and obviously any Black person can contradict me on this and say that I'm wrong. But it's like, that's, I would say, as a general rule, going to be taken very differently. It's going to be interpreted differently when it's happening within that sort of unequal dynamic than somebody saying something that is going through the same things as you. And that is, there are a lot of vegans that I feel don't want to acknowledge that. And not acknowledging that is really, not only is it dooming their efforts to fail in advocating for veganism and animal liberation, but it's number one harming all of us who are trying to advocate for that, because it's actually making it seem like we are coming from that perspective, even when we're not. It's just making it harder for everyone. It's even making it harder for, let's say, again, any Black person can contradict me on this, any Black vegan, but I would say that it makes it harder for Black vegans even a lot of times to advocate within their own community, because now there's that association again, right? There's that neural pathway that's formed between veganism and this movement that's trying to tell Black people what to do, that is not in solidarity with them. I mean, it just causes like so much harm on so many levels to what we're trying to accomplish, and also just to people who are already severely suffering and really trying to fight for their own basic human rights. And then you're going to heap more criticism on them, more pain for them. That's outrageous. Again, it's like, if we are a movement that stands for liberation, that opposes oppression, that opposes, these systems of domination and violence and hierarchy and all of that, we have to do that across the board. We can't just say, oh, it's wrong to do that to non-human animals, but doing that to people, humans, that's just fine. Like, this is something that we have to really look at as these are the foundations of what we stand for, and that's across the board. And again, that's not conditional. So, yeah.
And I feel that in that particular instance, the movement, or at least those who criticize the protester holding the pig head, failed to address other issues that would be really helpful to address, like weaponizing horses and dogs against protesters by the police.
Yes.
Exactly. Hierarchies and police action, and yes, right-wing mentalities and all that. That all this huge thing was not commented upon. There was room to address animal rights violations.
Yeah, and I mean, it's really telling, that they're choosing to focus on the oppressed group with this one incident of a pig, which again, there are pigs being violated and killed and consumed and tortured and all the rest of it everywhere in the society, right? So the fact that they chose to hyper-focus on that by one individual or small group of individuals in a massive movement of oppressed people, and then completely overlook the oppressor group's subjugation of non-human animals with the goal of weaponizing them against the oppressed human group is very telling. And, of course, I would say that people in the oppressed group that are fighting for their own liberation are going to see that. That's going to read that way to them, and rightfully so, because, again, double standards, right?
So
Big
Laura,
double standards there.
in that moment, if you're at that protest as a vegan, as a white vegan, for example, and you're standing next to this man who is holding the pig's head aloft, do you feel in that situation then we should suck it up? Even though obviously I know that if I had been next to this man, I would have felt uncomfortable no matter who was holding that pig's head. Do you know what I mean? It's something that I would find very difficult, because I know, and they're probably people walking around consuming pigs that day, wearing other animals, consuming other animals. And I suppose it's because it's a very iconic, impactful
visibility, though, isn't it? Wendy?
Impact and visibility. I suppose that there is that.
I mean,
also
nobody said anything about leather belts, did they? But I mean, that's not as visible as
it's not as visible and impactful. And I suppose that activists wanted that to be impactful. That was the whole point, wasn't it? In that instance. But should we then suck that up in that moment because we're in solidarity with these humans? Or so how do we deal with that? How do we, in a practical way, if we take theory out of it just a little bit and think, okay, in that moment, what do what do we do?
Also,
I would very.
How do we deal with it when we are outside the oppressed group? Because, for example, in
exactly.
March, being a group, I would feel that I have,
you'd be more
a larger
comfortable.
margin, to criticize other women around me for their speech.
Right.
Just because I belong to this oppressed group.
Yeah, I do think
there's one does not belong to that group.
Right. Definitely, there's a massive difference between those two scenarios, right? Okay, so if you are especially if you're a white vegan, but even if you're not white, but you are non-Black, but obviously, especially, and again, like, this is not for me to comment on, because I am white. So I'm going to focus on, especially if you're a white vegan in a group, in a protest for
white male
Black
vegan.
liberation.
Go on, say it, Laura. White male vegan. Go on, say it. I can take it. I can take it.
No, this is not specific to that. Any white vegan of any gender, that would be absolutely catastrophic if you tried to say something in that situation about the pig. Number one, you would just be adding stress to a group that is already, suffering and under enormous duress, and having to fear for their very lives that they're out there protesting because unlike I can't say never, but much less likely that a white person would be killed or beaten or imprisoned in a protest than a Black person. So they're already in danger. They're already stressed. They certainly don't need you coming at them and moralizing at them in that moment, or really ever. The other thing is that you not only would be hurting them by doing that, but you would gravely be harming the cause of animal liberation, because again, now you're going to form an association in the people in that crowd's minds with animal liberation and white people telling them what to do. White people criticizing them. White people who have victimized them for centuries having the audacity to take the moral high ground that they are morally superior and they're going to criticize Black people for their immorality. I mean, this is absolutely disastrous. Why would you do that? It is wrong on every level. It's wrong on the level of what is the right thing to do in that moment, which is to offer unconditional solidarity and support. And it's also wrong in the way, to a very, very oppressed human group, but it's also wrong on the pragmatic level. You're actually doing harm to the cause of animal liberation by doing something like that. So it would just be a disastrous move on every level. So now Nella's question, on the other hand, I see differently. If you are a member of the oppressed group that is engaging in the struggle for their own liberation. Now, here is where intersectionality does come into it, right? Because not all women are equally oppressed, and women are oppressed in different ways, and some women suffer not just sexism, misogyny, etc., but then they also have not only other layers of oppression, but also different ways that sexism or misogyny manifests for them, right? Racialized sexism, or they experience it differently because they've got, let's say, disabilities, or they live in a war zone, and and they're targeted on the basis of gender, or they are transgender, or there's so many different ways that women can suffer under patriarchy and sexism and misogyny. So even there, it's not flat, right? There's different types and levels and all that sort of thing. And that awareness just needs to inform everything that we do. And that's another really big part, I would say, of total liberation, and certainly intersectionality, is that awareness that we need to cultivate to really look at things in a multi-dimensional way. And that, by the way, is a term from Afko, from her book, Racism as Zoological Witchcraft, where she talks about a multi-dimensional liberation theory. So never looking at things as a single dimension, but all the different dimensions at once. So I mean, that even is going to have an effect that we should consider. Having said that, I do think that if you are a member of the oppressed group, that does make a significant difference for criticizing what's going on within that group. And I especially think that, because sometimes an oppressed group might still have a lot of privilege in some ways, right? So, for example, at the Women's March, I didn't go, but I saw video footage and photos and everything. And I mean, there were women, for example, that were holding up signs that were pro-NATO, NATO intervention, to liberate women in countries where they're being oppressed by their own culture. And that is very imperialist. And I definitely would say something if I saw that going on, that I'm a woman, right? And this person holding that sign is a woman, and there are people in the countries that they're talking about that are also women. But, we need to be considering the fact that there's...
Would that mean, Laura, would that mean that I couldn't say what you could say?
So that's a really good question, right? Because that then brings us to standpoint theory. And I know we were going to talk about that too. So for anyone who is unfamiliar with standpoint theory, or a commonly used phrase that you might have heard that refers to standpoint theory, stay in your lane, right? So Roger, stay in your lane. You're a man, right? You're not supposed to say anything about this. But here's the thing. I think that's a joke, by the way. I'm going to explain, obviously what I really think about that. But stay in your lane, or standpoint theory, I think that we first need to consider why standpoint theory was created and what is valid about it. But then also kind of look at where this can actually thwart our best efforts in some way, I would say. And things that we have to kind of like consider about how that might not be the right approach in all circumstances. So the first thing I was going to say about that is, so standpoint theory basically is this idea that, you know, the people in the oppressed group know what the oppressed group is experiencing and know, you know, the best solutions for how to alleviate that situation, how to liberate that group, not outsiders, and especially not people from the oppressor group. Now, so, you know, with women and men, for example, we'll say, you know, women advocating for their own liberation, if a man comes into the picture, he may not be directly in the position of oppressing the whole group, but he is still a member of the oppressor group, right? He's a member of the class that is the dominant class. And also, of course, men can oppress and harm women, you know, on an individual level as well. So, so that's going to be taken very differently if a man criticizes than if someone within the group criticizes, someone who is a marginalized gender, someone who is a fellow woman. You know, this is all going to be taken very differently than if a man does it. So there's a lot of validity to that. There is a reason why that idea was created and why it exists. And I have, for the most part, been a big supporter of it. But I also see that it can be a dangerous idea when used in the wrong hands and with the wrong motives. So something that I'm going to say about this that I thought was really helpful to making me aware exactly what the problem is an essay by a Nigerian philosopher whose name is Olufemi Otaiwo. And actually, he just came out with a book on the same subject, which I'm just absolutely dying to read once it comes out. And it's called Elite Capture. And what that refers to is this idea that people in positions of privilege and power can use standpoint theory to advance their agenda and silence those who would criticize it. And that can be a very dangerous thing. So I want to give a few examples of some really egregious incidents of this. The first one, of course, going back to what we were talking about earlier, was Zionism. Zionism is like the textbook case example of this, right? So Jewish people, and of course I am Jewish myself for anyone who doesn't know, so I am speaking from that perspective. I'm adhering to standpoint theory here now. But Jewish people are, of course, a historically extremely oppressed group. And as we have seen in recent years, anti-Semitism remains a very serious problem. And so Israel justifies its existence as a colonial apartheid state, occupying state, on the basis of Jews are an oppressed people, and this is something that we need to do for our own liberation, and nobody who is not Jewish can say otherwise. Stay in your lane, right? There's a really big problem with that, obviously, because it is not just Jewish people who are being affected by this. It is Palestinians, and in some cases, certainly other groups as well, African refugees within Israel, very oppressed, surrounding countries when Israel has attacked them, So, I mean, there are groups of people that are the victims here. And so to say, stay in your lane, only Jews can speak on this issue, is actually helping the oppressor group, not the oppressed group in this circumstance, which is not to say that Jewish people are not an oppressed group in the wider picture in other circumstances and historically, but in this specific incident, they are the privileged dominator group.
So
right?
Laura, this is really interesting. So I know you talk about this example, but just kind of going back to non-human animals, if if advocates are to stay in their lane, where does that leave non-human animals then, in terms of, you know, who can speak for them and who can advocate for them, be their allies, their accomplices? I mean, that's a little bit more complicated, isn't it? And how does that work? What's your thoughts on that?
Right. So that's the whole thing, right? Is that in that case, you know, to use Carol Adams's term for it, they're the absent reference. You know, and of course, when they are in the room and they're alive, they can advocate for themselves to some extent if the humans are actually listening and, you know, willing to hear what they are trying to communicate, even if it's not in our language or a language we can translate. Yeah, I mean, and this really brings me back to Olufemi Otaiwo's essay, because even though it was not written from a vegan or animal liberationist perspective, I think the line of logic that he's using really applies here, which is something that he calls being in the room privilege. So basically what he's saying is that, you know, when you have this idea of stay in your lane, standpoint theory, it's only the people that are present in that space and that can have their voices heard and understood that have a say in the matter. And it just so happens, of course, that a lot of the time it's the most privileged members of any group that are in the room. And therefore, what they have to say doesn't necessarily represent everybody else in that group. So yeah, this complicates further when you've got a group who generally is not present in the space, or even if they are present in the space, nobody can understand what they're saying or wants to. And, you know, it's very easy to say, well, I just don't understand. And, you know, that could mean anything. We don't know what that means, right? So, yeah, it is a complicated question when it is applied to the ethics of animal liberation. And what I would say about this, though, is that, again, this all comes back to, we have to, number one, have an awareness of how these systems of oppression within human society are going to affect how anything we have to say about non-human animals is received by different groups, right? We can't act as if there's no such thing as human, you know, differences in power dynamics within human society. That's not going to work. We have to always be conscious of that. And we have to consider that that's going to really influence how our words are received. And also, what influences how our words are received is, again, this idea of, do we unconditionally support the liberation of other humans? Or is that something that is conditional for us, right? So, because if it is conditional, then again, nobody's going to want to listen to us, you know, as a movement. And again, that's going to harm even the people who are in their lane, right? Even the people who are within those groups, those communities, it's going to make it harder for them to advocate for the non-human animals who are the absent reference. So we have to consider every aspect of how what we do and how we act as a movement is going to make it harder, not only for anyone to veer out of their lane, but even for people who are staying in their lane, so to speak. So, you know, I mean, basically it's like, and I certainly would say that anyone who is a member of the dominant oppressor groups, my God, if anyone is the worst oppressor of non-human animals, it's those who are also oppressing other humans, right? So they are the ones that we should be focusing on. But I will say that if we don't want standpoint theory to be used in a way that is manipulative and disingenuous and really is being used to try and stop liberation from happening, then we need to take a total liberationist approach, because that's how they get away with it. That's how the people who really want to sabotage movements for liberation are able to weaponize standpoint theory in that way, is because that's a weakness in any social justice movement if it's not taking a liberationist, total liberationist approach. That's something that they can exploit as a weakness then and say, well, look, they don't care about you, so why should you care about them or the group that they're advocating for?
Oh, well, this is such a fascinating topic, and you've done, you did a brilliant presentation on this, which unfortunately and sadly wasn't recorded, but I believe that Roger is going to introduce you doing that presentation again so that we've got a recorded version of it on YouTube, which will be amazing, because I definitely wanted to see that myself and didn't catch it at the time and was really disappointed when it wasn't recorded. So that's going to be coming up in the next couple of weeks, I think. Is that, Roger? Did you, I don't know if we had a planned time, but you're going to do the whole presentation. So if anyone wants to see that presentation, which is all about this, and see, you going through the points and how total liberation works, what are the ideologies, how is it put into practice, what's the kind of foundational kind of underpinning of the theory and everything, then that will be a really interesting thing to attend. And that's coming up soon.
2 hours. We could do it now if you want.
Well,
So yeah,
trying to avoid having a situation like last time where I was on like over and over and over and over again. It's like, let's just do it all.
Hey, Sebastian.
To get through it all.
Sebastian is here and says, so happy there will be a recording. Nice to see you, Sebastian. So yes, we will be.
We almost could have you back, really, because I mean, I sat through, endured really a live stream by some right-wing vegans or kind of right-leaning vegans yesterday, and I tried to look at it with an open mind, with this session in mind, and their pushback against you would be that you take a structural analysis, which is true, and they take an individual analysis, being right-wing. And so they would point out what you pointed out, which is that even within each different group, there are different power relations. And so therefore, you can't talk about groups anymore, in the same way as some people say that social class is dead, right? And so, we could almost, come back again in a way, just in this format even. But we'll talk about that off the air, because we've got to go now, I think. Is that right, Wendy?
Yes, I think we're going. You know what we're like. We'll just carry on all evening. So yeah, I think we're wrapping up. So we're gonna
all evening. You can just go on for 9 hours. Just keep talking.
A marathon session. So we're gonna leave people wanting more, and hopefully this is like a taster and a teaser for your brilliant presentation, Laura. So I can't wait to see it, and I hope that people here will tune in as well. We'll post that on the Animal Rights Show page, etc., and put that out there as soon as we know when that's happening. So
I think we should do a Laurathon. Right.
I'm game. No, people are like, oh my God, talk about like taking, an intersectional or total liberation of peers. People are going to be like, Laura, you're like taking up too much space here. Yeah.
Not at all. Not at all.
Let the animals talk for themselves, for God's sake, let the other species have a word to get in edgewise.
Laurathon.
No,
right, people.
It's always so good to hear your perspective on things, Laura.
Thanks so much, Laura, for your contribution, as always. And thanks for everybody who tuned in and asked some really good questions, and also had some great conversations in the chat. So if you want to watch that back, you can then see it in duality there. So thanks very much, people. And
thanks, everyone. So good to see everyone.
See
you next month.
Bye.
Bye.